Hello, learners, and welcome to the 43rd lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century Anglophone women's novel. I have been discussing the life and work of Bessie Head with a special focus on the history and the context of apartheid in South Africa, as well as some of the more philosophical interventions in questions of identity, especially the intersections between categories of identity, such as race and gender, in the work of philosophers who were contemporaneous with Bessie Head. In the previous lecture, I spent some time discussing the work of Frantz Fanon, the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, as well as the philosopher Helen Sixou, and how there are some very powerful, almost uncanny similarities in the way that the ideas of these writers and thinkers come together in images like that of Medusa in the novel A Question of Power. I will focus this lecture a little bit more directly on the novel itself and try and wrap up our study of the novel in this or maybe the subsequent lecture. So I think that there are a few ideas that I will mention in the abstract to frame this discussion of the way the text unfolds in A Question of Power. The first idea is the ontological status of the mind, and especially the interiority and how real the internal life of a person's mind is, especially how real that life is relative to the material conditions in which the person lives. This is a question that the novel forces us to ask ourselves on almost every page. So I'll reflect a little bit on this question and also explain what kind of answer the novel provides. The second idea, which I think is very relevant, is the idea of nature and especially the relationship between human labor and the natural world. Even more specifically, the novel reflects on the idea of cultivating nature, specifically domesticating nature, controlling the development of the natural world in a way that would be beneficial to human beings. There's a name for this. It is called agriculture, and the protagonist spends a lot of time engaging in this kind of activity, and it has some very important implications for the geographical as well as the psychological conditions in which the protagonist finds herself. So, nature and agriculture. And these are the two ideas that I will be reflecting on. Some quotes from the novel which will help us enter this conversation. The narrator uses this expression that the events that we read about in A Question of Power describe, quote, nightmarish soul journey, unquote, that is undertaken by the protagonist Elizabeth. There's another quote which is on page 29, and this gives us a very good insight into how we are to take in the descriptions that we find in the pages of A Question of Power. The narrator reflects, speaking from Elizabeth's perspective, that, and I quote, her slowly unfolding internal drama was far more absorbing and demanding than any drama she could encounter in Motabeng village, unquote. So this gives us an insight into how the novel creates a relationship between two realities. The reality of Botswana, where the protagonist finds herself, the physical and the political realities of a particular place in a particular time. This reality includes the climate of Botswana, the soil, the physical conditions of Botswana, also the economic conditions of Botswana. It's an extremely difficult and impoverished land, and in this land, Elizabeth, the protagonist, has joined a group of social workers funded by international charitable organizations, sort of like the modern NGOs, also funded by people with very strong Christian views. And some of these people also happen to have extremely racist views. But nonetheless, the point is, Elizabeth is immersed in a very specific kind of climate, topography, and physical environment. And in this environment, this group of individuals is struggling to make a difference, struggling to improve the lives of people in rural Botswana. They're doing that by offering a range of services, educational services. They're educating the people, they're working as teachers, but most importantly, they're also working as cultivators. They are finding newer, more sustainable forms of agriculture, modes of agriculture that use less water and which work with the arid conditions of Botswana. And despite those arid conditions, despite the lack of resources, despite the abject poverty of these places, both economic poverty as well as the nutritional poverty of the soil, despite these conditions, these individuals are attempting with varying degrees of success to establish a sustainable and successful mode of agriculture. So this is the external reality, and it also includes the various cultural hierarchies, the dynamics of race and racial and economic inequality through which these sustainable modes of agriculture and despite which these sustainable modes of agriculture are being produced. This is one set or one kind of reality in which Elizabeth finds herself. The other reality is that which exists inside Elizabeth's mind. And in this reality, there is a different set of characters, primarily three characters, two men and one woman. The men are named Cello and Dan, and the woman is Medusa. These three individuals, with varying degrees of kindness and cruelty, and with varying degrees of realism, and with varying kinds of intensity, very frequently attack and abuse, but also sometimes comfort and console Elizabeth. And so a lot of the novel consists of dream sequences in which Elizabeth describes individuals, frequently one or more of these three that I've just named, perform all kinds of antics. Sometimes they involve verbal abuse, which most frequently comes from Dan and Medusa, but it also sometimes involves philosophical reflections on the history and the future of the African continent, but also sometimes African people, and sometimes very specifically Black African communities. These most frequently come from Cello, who reflects almost like a Gandhian or a sort of Nelson Mandela type of figure, who often reflects on the options that were available to Black Africans and sometimes specifically Black South Africans, and why many of those options for liberation ended up in failure. So these are two worlds, and Elizabeth is always on the verge of collapse, struggling to function despite being pulled in opposite directions by the events and the characters in these two worlds. In fact, at one point in the middle of the novel, Elizabeth has a breakdown. And this breakdown segues into something else which I want to discuss as I wrap up our discussion of A Question of Power, which is the autobiographical nature of this novel. In the previous lecture, I quoted from two passages which were uncannily similar. The first of these passages was from Bessie Head's autobiographical writings, A Woman Alone, and the second was from the first chapter of A Question of Power. And we noted how the exact same words, phrases, construction of sentences were used to describe these two individuals. so much so that we may be forgiven for taking both of these individuals to be the same person. The protagonist of A Question of Power, Elizabeth, and the person who's authored A Question of Power, that is Bessie Head. I'll very briefly run through the similarities which is documented as being common to both of these individuals. Both of these individuals are born out of biracial relations, and given the circumstances of the world in which they are born, biracial relations between the mother of these protagonists and a man outside their racial background is pathologized because it is seen as criminal and an illegal activity. There's just no way in which their society can accept the humanity of these relationships. And so both of their mothers are pathologized, considered mentally ill, and confined to mental hospitals. It is assumed by everyone around these two individuals that the biracial relations of which they were born, that is, both Elizabeth and Bessie Head, could only have been the result of a kind of sickness or some departure from normal behavior. This pathologization of human relations continues, and Elizabeth and Bessie both are threatened with the same kind of confinement because it is assumed that they will follow in the same line or along the same path as their mothers had done. And so both Elizabeth and Bessie Head threatened with confinement if they do not conform to those extremely rigid and narrow race and class relations. And the similarities continue because in their modes of struggle, in their resistance to these extremely rigid and unequal hierarchies, they end up in similar situations. Both Elizabeth and Bessie had tried their careers as teachers, which they very soon abandon. Both, incidentally, end up marrying violent, womanizing, toxic men, and both end up having a child from a man like that. Both eventually leave this man and South Africa, but they leave South Africa on an exit pass. It's a one-way exit document, which means that they are allowed to leave South Africa, but they are not allowed to return. Both of them move to the neighboring country of Botswana. And here, both of them join charity organizations where they meet groups of independent, liberal-minded European scientists, teachers, agriculturists, and social workers, and begin working there as community builders. They begin to do a mix of teaching and cultivation, and it is through their immersion in this kind of work that both Elizabeth and Bessie Head, in different ways, and this is verified from different sources, biographical and historical sources for Bessie Head, and A Question of for Elizabeth, through their immersion in this kind of what can be called, roughly speaking, service work, both these individuals begin to find stability in their lives, both in terms of their very difficult and turbulent mental state, as well as in terms of finding a sustainable source of professional engagement. Of course, this late stability, although it was much sought after, it proved to be a very short-lived state for Bessie Head, because she, just as Bessie Head was beginning to find success as a novelist and was beginning to be published in Europe, London, and even the US, her life was abruptly cut short as she succumbed to illness. So, a very short and tragic life. But there's one thing to note, which is common to both of these individuals and which we read about in A Question of Power, which is that for Bessie Head, human decency, the basic act of kindness towards another human being, this was a very high ideal, and it became a sort of a mode of resistance, a mode of empowering herself against many of the other forms of exercising power that Bessie had saw around her. And this also gives me a moment to reflect on why the novel is titled A Question of Power. Power is a question because through the development of this individual, Elizabeth, through the racial politics of two southern African nations, and through her involvement with the many attitudes towards Black Africans that she witnesses, and also through her experience of suffering different kinds of racist attitudes, both the racism that was directed towards Black South Africans as well as the racism that was directed towards white South Africans. Bessie had and Elizabeth, due to their biracial status, ended up suffering both and ended up reflecting on why human beings were like that and what was the meaning of these attitudes or these relations. And in a way, this novel, A Question of Power, can be called a distillation or a compression or a crystallization of the learning that the author and the protagonist is able to draw from these very painful and disturbing experiences of being perceived as a sort of less than human being because of the color of their skin. And because of that, the conception of human nature that emerges from this novel is that of a constant state of struggle between good and bad forms of power. It's almost a little bit allegorical, and the text that I was thinking about as I was reading some of the pages in the second half of A Question of Power is actually a very old text, and which I've mentioned earlier in this course, and I think it was during the discussion of Iris Murdoch's philosophical fiction, but the text came to mind again as I was reading A Question of Power. And specifically, there are some passages in which Bessie Head writes about the human soul as being a sort of tussle between good and evil, or if not the human soul being a tussle, but the human soul being pulled in two different directions by forces of good and evil. The text that I was thinking of is the Socratic dialogue Phaedrus, in which we get this image of the human mind as a chariot that's being pulled in two directions by two sets of horses, one black and one white. And there is an allegorical dimension to the way Bessie Head describes human nature in this novel. And the reason why the novel is titled A Question of Power is, I think, because Elizabeth comes to this realization that human nature is essentially violent and it is drawn towards wanton and unchecked and sometimes immoral and unethical acts of power. The only question is, can these exercises of power be directed in directions which will mean that in the long run they will produce the greater good for the greater number of people? Because in the shorter run, there will always be violence, there will always be pain, there will always be inequality. The question is how to direct the use of power in a direction which can ensure the greatest good in the long run. That is the sort of ethical goal that the protagonist Elizabeth sets for herself. And the majority of this reflection and this understanding of this kind of an ethical mission comes through the service work, that is teaching and agriculture and cultivation based work that Elizabeth engages in rural Botswana. I want to reflect a little bit, very briefly, on the history of the English novel as a genre and how that history reaches a kind of crisis point in this novel. I've mentioned several times in this course that the English novel has mercantile origins. It begins with the work of middle class, upper middle class, business owning, merchant type characters and figures like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And the novel has also been very deeply invested in material facts. Therefore, the English novel has been very conscious of class and economic power, which is not to say that novel has always been conservative or has always supported the interest of the bourgeois class. The novel has been very critical, and even in the origins of the English novel, we can find writers like Jane Austen who described economic class and class inequality not to celebrate or not to endorse inequality, but rather to describe the humanity of those individuals who struggled against it as well. But nonetheless, the point I'm making here is that the English novel has had a material bias. It tends to describe the real world, the material world, with an assumption that it matters more, or the reality of the material world matters more than, say, the reality of the character's mind or their spiritual or their emotional life. This is also a distinction between the kind of writing that we find in a novel. It is descriptive and almost naturalistic and scientific. It is not analytical or philosophical. That changes in the early 20th century with the shift from Victorian to modernist and eventually postmodernist novels. And a novel that very powerfully demonstrates the beginning of this shift towards a new tendency, a new awareness that what goes on in the lives and the minds and the hearts of individuals is as real as what goes on in the world in which they live. So, for instance, is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. There are moments in Mrs. Dalloway when the internal workings of the thoughts of two characters, that is, Clarissa Dalloway, but also Septimus Smith, assume the reality of the world in which they live. So, the workings of an internal combustion engine in a motor car, or the workings of British colonialism in India, are as real as the thoughts, the anxieties, the sicknesses, the different kinds of struggles with illness that these two individuals are undergoing. Now, I would argue that A Question of Power takes that awareness to a new high and almost produces a moment of crisis, because the narrator makes it extremely difficult for readers to decide which reality deserves more attention or more analysis and more speculation, whether it is the dreams that Elizabeth is having, or is it the kind of politics and scientific experiments that Elizabeth and her group of community builders and social workers are dealing with. And that inability to decide is deliberate, it is not accidental, it is part of the novel's design. The novel, I believe, is teaching us to inhabit a very complex and ambiguous ontological space. And I'll borrow from Craig Mackenzie, the scholar who's written, I think, the first biographical and critical study of Bessie Head's work, who argues that in A Question of Power, we read a novel that inhabits a very different kind of a psychological terrain. This is not a novel which represents the inner life of a woman like Elizabeth. Instead, it is a novel which is set literally in the actual space of the psyche of this individual. So it is not that the novel describes what happens in Elizabeth's mind from the outside. Rather, the novel is situated, or the author attempts to situate the novel as much as possible in Elizabeth's mind. And so it turns the tables a little bit, ontologically speaking. It invites us to examine all of the politics, all of the racial dynamics, all of the economics, and all of the agriculture as being given its reality through the kind of psychological tensions that exist in Elizabeth's mind. So it's not that it's Elizabeth's fault that she's unable to function or unable to do the social work that she's doing. Rather, the social work or the political work itself becomes real through the psychological problems that it creates in Elizabeth's mind. So I'll stop this discussion here and wrap up our discussion of a question of power in the next lecture. Thank you.